Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for making time today to be part of this conversation. My name's Pete Van Leer. I'm a senior researcher with Policy Matters Ohio, where our mission is to create a more prosperous, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive Ohio. Welcome to our discussion about the American Rescue Plan and you. This is episode 2 on education. It's just one of a 5-part series about how federal policy can make a concrete difference in our communities and in our lives. Thanks so much again for joining us. You might be joining us on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter at Policy Matters OH. Whichever platform you're joining us on, please like our page, follow us, or subscribe to our channel. Today's discussion is going to be focused on how funds from the American Rescue Plan can be used to help Ohio schools recover from the pandemic and build for a more equitable future. How these funds are used matters. We know that we'll all thrive when every Ohioan, no matter their race or income, can pursue their educational goals wherever their abilities and aspirations take them. Today, you're going to hear from experts on education, including Wendy Patton, the project director at Policy Matters, Daryl Johnson, legislative director at the Ohio Federation of Teachers, and Prentice Haney, co-director of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative and executive director of the Ohio Student Association. And again, I'm Pete Van Leer, and a lot of my work with Policy Matters focuses on higher education, so I'll be pitching in on that issue. So billions of dollars will be flowing into Ohio schools, both K-12 and colleges and universities. And like with many aspects of our society, and you've probably heard this before, even people who weren't paying attention before can see more clearly than ever the structural inequities that have kept too many people from accessing a quality education. We've seen disparities, for example, with urban school districts that are less able to bring students back in person than schools in wealthier communities, the private schools. And enrollment in community colleges at the higher ed level, the enrollment at community colleges have been hit much harder than at four-year schools. So it's on our leaders to make sure these funds are used as a bridge to a more equitable future, to do everything they can to make sure we don't stay stuck in the past. It's on us as residents and advocates in Ohio to make sure these funds are used to make a real, lasting difference for every Ohioan, no matter where we live or what we look like. So I'm going to start off with just a quick personal question for participants, for our panelists. And Wendy, maybe you can start to share a story about the impact equitable or inequitable access to education has had on your life. Can you talk about that?
Thanks, Pete. I'm a teacher's daughter. My dad was a teacher and a principal. He wrote the first bylaws for the first teachers union in Westerville, probably in the 1950s, and spent many years of his career at Central School in Bedford up in the Cleveland area. Central School in the 1970s was a community learning center. The families were in there with the students. Parents were encouraged to come in and teach whatever they wanted to teach. That people taught woodworking, they taught gardening, they taught crocheting. The school was the heart of the community. This is the way that it should be. But we've had this terrible last year in which students have been divorced from teachers, families from schools because of the pandemic and the recession. I think that the American Rescue Act funds that we see flowing in this year, these are really rescue funds to start to reknit and restore and reestablish that important bond between community and school.
Thanks, Wendy. Daryl, can you jump in with your story?
Sure. I was born in Washington, D.C., and my mother's a teacher. And, Washington, D.C. is the nation's capital, but it's also a segregated community when I was a kid. And we were part of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so I learned the difference about public education when we moved from DC to a suburb, and then learning what the haves and the have not have. But I'm not going to throw the teachers that I had early on under the bus, but because it was a community that was tight, that was really pushing African-American students to do the best they can because they had to work twice as hard. But I see that continue today. I mean, we're talking about from my youth to entering school, to seeing my kids going to school, and seeing my nieces and nephews go to school, and seeing that disparity between what goes on between schools in Franklin County. So I have family friends who their daughters went to Columbus public schools, and my kids went to a suburban school, and the kids would ask me, why do Dublin schools have this and Columbus schools don't? And I thought, if a fifth grader could ask me that question, we need to do something. And so it's something that's been very real, something that we need to address, and for a very long time, because every child everywhere should have the opportunity for the best education possible. And so that's why I'm here, and pleased to be working with the Ohio Federation of Teachers, and pleased to see what the American Rescue Plan has provided to schools all across this country.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Prentice, I'd love to hear from you, like a quick story about education.
Absolutely. Again, my name is Prentice Haney, and I'm with the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. And my story around education, or really inequitable education, my experience is that growing up in Dayton, Ohio, is that when schools and the resources for schools are inequitable, it meant in my community that people left. And so when I was a student at Stiver School for the Arts, I was a writing major. I did creative writing, and I told my stories in that way. And all these students were, are dancers or are musicians. And that's how we grew and expressed ourselves. But then, when we lost our levy, those adjunct teachers left. And so one of my favorite creative writing teachers had no longer had a job because those resources weren't there. And that changed how the students in our program could actually grow and develop in their craft. And then I just thought that was an experience that happened in public schools. But when I went up to Wright State University, I remember my first year, I was super excited. I was on campus, and there were a bunch of Black students in the housing area. And I felt like I was in a really strong community of folks who were ready to get a good education at a working class school. And then the next year, it felt like a ghost town. Because those students, one, did not come back. And then the amount of African-American students that came as entering students dramatically decreased because the funding formula for need-based aid and then the resources changed. And so literally, Black students did come back to campus. And so my experience is that when systems are inequitable, people don't come back. Rather, they are like good teachers who help our schools, or rather they are promising students of color who cannot access the education that they deserve. And no matter what we look like or where we come from, we all deserve to have a quality education.
Thanks, Prentice, and thank you all for those stories. I think they're very relevant to the moment about what's happening now and how we can rebuild and create a more equitable system. And the rescue funds really represent an opportunity to do that. I'm going to tell a quick story about community college, my experience there. Early in my adult career, I was doing a lot of journalism. I was working as a PowerPoint writer. And back in the 90s, there was this transition from film cameras to digital. And I was trying to get on top of that. And I took a class at my community college here in Cleveland, Tri-C. And it was amazing. It just got me really up to speed. And it was affordable, and it was accessible. I took it at a time and it worked for me. And I think that's, I'm relatively savvy and well off enough to pay for it pretty easily, but that accessibility and the affordability of it matters to so many people around the state. And now more than ever, as people are trying to retrain and be ready for the economy that's coming, I think that community college experience is really relevant to a lot of people and to this moment. So with that, I'd like to dive into the big question, right? The American Rescue Plan and the funds that are coming to Ohio. And I'd like to start with Wendy. If you could give us sort of a high-level take on the rescue funds for K-12 education in terms of what's coming into the state and what are some of the things that they can be used for on the K-12 level. Wendy, you're muted.
Got it. Thank you. The American Rescue Plan is really aptly named. It's a rescue plan. The pandemic is not over. The recession is not yet over. And the funds in the American Rescue Plan for education are meant to rescue students and schools and teachers and officials and communities from what's been really a very tough year. The monies that are coming into Ohio are carefully targeted and closely monitored. The primary source of funding that we're hearing about is allocation of $4.4 billion for Ohio's 610 school districts, which incorporate thousands and thousands of schools. It can be spent over 3.5 years' time. The money has already started to flow. In March, because of the emphasis on trying to help schools open safely and securely, some of the money was released in March of this year, so schools are already seeing the benefit. The funds are meant for specific uses. A primary use is to protect the health and safety of staff and students. And so, to mitigate the ongoing virus, children are not vaccinated, not all adults are vaccinated, and to prevent any further disease or surge of the virus. So changes in the physical facility can be paid for with the American Rescue Plan dollars, everything from, hand washing through ventilation, keeping windows open. The money can pay for school tutoring and enrichment courses. I know here in Columbus, there's been a problem with schools not being air conditioned. The money can help with that kind of thing so that schools can start to provide what is needed to help students catch up on what for many may be a year of lost learning in a safe and comfortable environment. Of course, a very critical component of the funds, 20% of the funds must be used to assess learning loss among students and devise plans to address that learning loss in meaningful ways. The money can be used to address the emotional and social needs and mental health needs of students. Schools can hire counselors and nurses and social workers, and they can rehire staff that's been laid off. Nationally, 8 local education positions, employment is still down by almost 9%. A lot of school districts have budget shortfalls. A lot of people lost their jobs. The recession is not over in all communities and all school districts. So the money can be used to rehire staff that was laid off and to make sure that there's sufficient staff for tutoring and for aftercare and summer school and special enrichment courses to help students catch up. Now, a very important component of use of funds, and indeed schools, in order to get the final third of their share of the funds, must have in place a plan. And this plan for how the funds will be used has to be developed with substantial public input. The regulations guiding the use of K through 12 funds specify that public input has to be received from the general public, from students, families, teachers, school officials, unions, representatives of students with disabilities, incarcerated students, child protective services, community officials. So the plan that schools need to be working on need to address the needs of the school district in each school as developed by those who are involved in it. This will help knit that community back together that has been separated and needs time to be knit back together. Further, you should be aware that these funds will be very helpful. Some districts really lost a lot of money. Property values have plunged in some places. Some districts, particularly in areas of lower income, will need additional aid. The state of Ohio receives $5.4 billion, and that money, one of the uses for that money is to add to educational services in lower income census tracts and for lower income districts. This is a wonderful way to complement what districts need. It can be used for early education and preschool, as well as ongoing tutoring and meeting of students' needs. So we have deep needs in the educational community. Students and families have needs. Districts need both staff and physical facility upgrades to deal with a safe post-pandemic environment. This funding allows schools to get started, allows classes to open, allows the school and community to knit back together again. And it's going to take a full, at least the 3.5 years that these funds can be spent to make that happen. So that's sort of an overview. Pete, back to you.
Great, thanks a lot. That was a great overview. It really gives us a good sense of what's happening with what's possible and what's happening with those funds for K-12 education. Daryl, when we were preparing for this conversation, you talked a lot about how the American Rescue Plan can address the needs of the whole child. Can you talk a bit about what you mean by this?
So one of the things that we have to look at is that learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. One of the things that we need to consider is the health of the child, the safety of a child, how engaged the child is in the community, the supports they need to learn, and the challenge that they have for academics. And that's what we consider the whole spectrum of whole child. And so when you look at where this money can go, they really do address these kind of components. For example, the rescue plan helps provide support for childcare, helps provide support for rental assistance, and tax credits for families who are living in poverty. That's important because if you address those conditions at home and improve those conditions at home, they'll come to school more ready to learn. And if they have access to health care, if their parents have access to health care, they have access to food assistance, which is also included in the rescue plan, then that will help the child learn. Learning loss, social emotional trauma, all these things are also supported by the American Rescue Plan. The rescue plan provides resources for wraparound services and social emotional services because we know that kids either in suburban communities, in wealthy communities, and low-income communities, or low-wage communities, they have suffered some kind of trauma this past year. And so addressing those concerns, I mean, the suicide rate in Ohio is higher than it has been in 3 years. So we understand that children are suffering. And so having those resources will help. Addressing the physical environment is important because while Ohio has had resources for school facilities, not every community has been able to get those bonds passed so they can update their facilities. So there are districts like Maple Heights and Warrenville Heights and Cleveland and some rural communities like Belpre and other smaller communities that have not been able to pass a bond levy. And so they can use these resources to improve ventilation in buildings, to provide air conditioning in buildings, so that, usually in the summer, it sounds like, strange, but we will have school start in August and we'll have days off in August because it's too hot. And so those are the kind of things that we are, and so we have to look at, and this resource is these resources are provided in the rescue plan. Pete? Well, Pete might be frozen. So, Prentice, we haven't heard from you. So why don't you share your views on this part?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, like you said, and also Wendy said, is that we see this as a rescue plan, but also a down payment for how our K through 12 system could function. So one of the things that I'm super excited about is so many of our members from the Ohio Student Association come from our public school systems. And so what we've heard when we are talking about, for example, fair school funding or racial equity in schools, what they're excited about is that not only will these dollars help bring people out of a deficit, but it'll help, these school districts actually start to imagine what would it look like to have full wraparound services, to have mental health services in schools, and to really level the playing field in rural and urban and suburban districts. And I think that one of the things that our members would like to see happen is not only that these dollars are spent in communities to just level the playing field, but to also show what could happen if we had real state-based revenue that actually could sustain the sort of investments we got federally. And so this is just the beginning. I'm excited about the next year, next 1 to 3 years, because we actually get to see what happens when our students get world-class schools. And then I think that'll create the opportunity politically for us to continue to fight for that in our state and then make some of these things permanent.
Yeah, I think that's those are all great points. And one of the other points that Melissa Cropper, our president at the Federation of Teachers, talks about is that we should take this opportunity to evaluate how we improve schools. I mean, now it's the time to sort of reset. We have resources that we can use over a period of time from the federal government. We have resources that we hope the state will invest to fulfill its commitment to making sure that we have high quality education provided to every child everywhere with the state budget, through the state budget. And so I think this is a time to sort of re-engage the community, for community partners like Wendy was talking about, how we get parents and, all the list that she read off, the parents, the social workers, the community, the students, the faith community, all to sit down and say, how do we make these schools, based on what we saw in the past year, better, and environments and places where people want to come, and to make these public schools the schools of choice, and that's what's before us. And so, I think that we are, one of the things that's out there that the rescue plan has provided and that the state's providing is access to broadband and more money for broadband. So, and I think we're missing Pete, but maybe we need better broadband service in Cleveland. So we got better broadband. Yay. So
yeah.
Now I'll moderate back.
Hopefully, yeah, and that is one of the things that we do with the with this money, right? The rescue plan money. So it's definitely needed for some reason, unless it was my computer. But yeah, so I'm a little bit out of sorts here, but I think we should just about your issues. Can we look at one thing that's interesting about on the higher ed front is that this is double the amount of the previous rescue money coming in. So it's really a huge opportunity. I
can speak on that, Paul. Pete.
Okay.
I know you're breaking up a little bit, but well, one of the things I want to say, you're absolutely right. This is a significant investment in higher ed, more than we saw in the last sort of rescue package. You know that about half of the money for public and private nonprofit colleges and universities is for direct grants to students and for-profit schools, and they're required to grant these to students. So, I think one of the things that was super important for Ohio Student Association is that last year, when the pandemic started, we started a survey program for our membership to actually understand, what do students really need in this moment? What do they need to get back on their feet, to get back in school, to complete their degrees? And there was a couple of things that came up time and time again. One, cash assistance and direct programs. Many of our members, especially some of our members at historically Black colleges, were going back to like Michigan or Detroit or Chicago or whatever, and they surprisingly are some of the biggest breadwinners in their family. So they were going back home with no jobs and not having the resources they need to actually like take care of the family that they need to take care of once they get back home, and also to be present for school. And so just cash assistance to make sure that students could actually live and take care of their families, childcare assistance when they were home. The other piece is broadband, which we're experiencing today. Internet access, making sure that students had access to internet at an affordable rate, and that it was also free. The other thing that a lot of students named as a big issue was just because of the abrupt end of like jobs. People lost, work study jobs. People had to leave their communities where they were working part-time and they were paying for, tuition. So many of these students end up leaving the university with small debts, like, oh, I didn't pay this parking fee, or I didn't get to pay the rest of my housing fee or my textbooks that's on my account. And then by the time they returned back to campus or returned back to school, these fees had compounded. And because of the current laws in Ohio, that sort of debt, which is institutional debt, had to be referred to the AG's office, which started a pattern where so many students are in debt to the institution, trying to figure out how to pay that off without having the income, without having the degree, and also trying to figure out how to finish school. And so I think, from our vantage point, like the other 50%, the other half of money that we have in Ohio for higher ed, there's a lot of ways we could spend it. Direct payments to students, absolutely. Making sure that they get cash assistance for living and going to school. I think the other piece is forgiving institutional debt. There should be no one who cannot complete their degree or get their transcripts because they have a fee that is that they cannot afford. We have members who were attempting to go to law school but could not actually get in or finish the application because they owed $500 a year or two ago, and they didn't have $500 when they left college in a debt. That $500 could be forgiven, using this money from the American Rescue Plan. And I think the other thing is helping to actually increase need-based aid. Our state has slashed need-based aid since I think it was 2009, and we have not recovered from those decline in need-based aid. And so I think that we can actually put money into that pot, and then eventually fix some of the tax code issues so that we actually have enough revenue to keep our need-based aid at the level that it needs to be at.
I wonder if I can step in here, Pete, and just say that Prentice has brought up a number of actionable steps that Ohio's legislators could take to spend the American Rescue Act plan in ways to rescue people. Right now, we're seeing Ohio's legislators put money into CARES Act money from last year, into a lot of business assistance for restaurants and hotels, for small businesses. It is time to put money into people. The money coming directly to the state, the $5.4 billion coming to the state, spells out that it should be used in payments for essential workers, people who work in one-on-one in childcare, with a lot of interaction with the public in retail and food. This is one way of getting aid to low-income families. A way of addressing students is to provide emergency assistance for the kind of payment of transcripts and fees that would allow them to return to school using the state monies. So what Prentice has outlined in the needs of the students can be addressed by the American Rescue Act plans. We need our legislators to create programs to make this happen. Very sensible recommendations. Need to see more of it happen.
And Wendy, if I may add one other thing, When it comes to our student parents, depending on how what they're doing for work, they could be in another sort of cycle. Federal work study jobs, which a number of our student parents have, don't qualify for unemployment benefits because it's not considered a job. And then also a lot of our younger members and students have not had a long enough work history to qualify for certain unemployment benefits. So then when it comes to being a parent and you're trying to figure out how to go to school and you're not qualifying for the sort of assistance that you should get, this sort of money that's coming in, along with the child tax credit that's going to help 92% of families in Ohio, our universities could also have childcare subsidies that are supporting young parents and making sure that they have enough to go to school, put food on the table, and making sure that their children is receiving what they need.
You're right, Prentice. The Rescue Act funds are designed to rescue people and communities that are hit the hardest. The regulations, both for the state funds and for the K through 12 funds, highlight and emphasize the need to get those monies to people who are struggling, like the students on work study that you described. This is an excellent use of both the state funds and the educational funds. And we need to work with our lawmakers so that they develop programming and actually funnel the money to those needs. The monies are more flexible when it comes to helping people who have been impacted the hardest by the pandemic and recession. Surely there's no one who's been harder hit than work study students. So this is exactly the kind of rescue that those monies are for.
And it is also good to make sure that we have the faculty that we need. When Prentice talked about losing faculty at both Wright State and in his high school, we want to make sure that we restore those faculty members to particularly those community colleges, because those are the gateway to entryway to new careers as this world changes in terms of work. We're going to need people who can quickly adapt and change, and they're going to need access to, like as Pete was saying, getting access to different courses that could help them move into a new career and be better prepared for the changes in their current career. So I think those are important factors too. But the key fundamental thing, as Prentice and Wendy were talking about, is you. All of us have a role to play in making sure these dollars are spent. The Ohio Senate now has the budget. They will have they're having the Senate Finance Committee this week and next week, and they will probably vote on the budget after Memorial Day. But we have to make sure that they don't just give tax breaks to the wealthy. We have to make sure that they fund K-12, meet their responsibilities, and make sure that we go through the process that's outlined in the rescue plan, that school districts, 609 of them, and the charter schools as well, come together, develop a plan about how we want to move forward. So engaging your district at the district level, engaging the senators at the state level, is all going to be important over the summer and in the next coming weeks, because we have to hold all policymakers accountable. And there's no better way to message about where the state is committing its resources and its concerns than through their budget. As Prentice says, and a lot of people say, it is a moral document, and it speaks to the commitments to how we invest in people and families, keeping them in their homes, keeping them fed, making sure they have access to childcare, reducing child poverty, and making sure that we have good quality schools everywhere.
Gerald, I'm just wondering if Gerald, if you could talk a little bit more about that local engagement. I mean, you talk about talking to school districts. What are the best? I mean, different needs in different districts, right? So, what do you see as the best ways to do that engagement? Like the actions that people can take in their local communities? Is it the PTA? Is it the school board? How do you organize?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that people need to do is, if they are part of the PTA, go to their PTA and ask the superintendent, go to board meetings, and ask the members about, we understand we're supposed to be involved in this process and we want to be involved in this process. How are you going to involve us? And I think that that is required to start at that local level. So what we would like to see, and what we have done in Cincinnati in some of our schools, is we have community learning centers and we have local decision-making teams. And those local decision-making teams are comprised of parents, students, administrators, teachers, community members, and social service organizations. And they decide what programs they want in that school. And it's up to that team that look at the services and make sure those services are meeting the needs of the students. And if they're not, that service is, let go. And I think that's what we want everywhere. We have an amendment that we're trying to get in the budget that would create a community learning center, technical assistance center, so that we can make sure that we engage the community in a way that parents and teachers and students and community leaders and have a stake of what's going in that building. We're talking about building by building, not a cookie cutter approach. We want building by building plans. And because they have all these resources available to them now, be they large districts, small districts, urban, suburban, or rural districts, we all need to be engaged. And I would say the place to start is with your superintendent and school board, engaging them. But as a collective, people of faith, the faith community should come together. The fraternal and sorority organizations should come together. Neighborhood associations should come together and say, this is what we want the schools in our neighborhood to look like. So wherever we gather in groups, those groups should move to the local school boards and superintendents to talk to them about how we make use of these resources that are coming our way for the next couple of years, and how we improve education everywhere.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's, Wendy, you raised the issue about not backfilling and really using, and what you're talking about, Darren, is using the money in a way that it's really going to, not just a one-time benefit, but to build something that's really different. Wendy, can you talk a little bit about, the overall funding piece, and where you see that the risk of just how the money is used if it's not used well?
Yeah, Pete. Right now, the state is considering the state budget, as they always do every 2 years. And the danger of having the Rescue Act money come in, even as the legislature is thinking, well, how do we fund education, is that they will not fully understand. The danger is that state lawmakers will not fully recognize the American Rescue Act dollars as rescue funds, as one-time funds meant to knit the school and the community back together and repair the damage to students, and that they will instead assume that these monies will go into schools for academics, and therefore they will not properly fund schools. That's the danger. Right now, we're on the cusp of fixing Ohio's broken school funding formula. It was the ways Ohio funds schools was found unconstitutional because it was so unfair 24 years ago. It relies too much on the property tax. Communities with low property values and low incomes do not have the same level of education, the same quality of education in Ohio as communities that have higher income levels. It's not a thorough and efficient education across all of the state of Ohio. The legislators are right now considering the Fair School Funding Plan, which could fix that. We need them to move forward and fix the existing school funding system. The primary problem with it is that the basic way in which we fund schools is under-resourced. It pits parents against teachers and community against community. We need more state resources in schools, and we need a better funding formula. The danger is that lawmakers will hide behind the American Rescue Act plan and say schools have enough money, we're going to give them a little less than we would ordinarily because they could get this money from the federal government. No, those dollars are needed for special purposes, and it's really up to the public participation, to the parents and students and teachers, business people, unions, community leaders that come into this planning process to say, no, wait a minute. We need rescue. We need good ventilation systems. We need better facilities. We need extra tutors. We need a lot of mental health counselors on site. Let's use these funds to rescue the schools and use the state budget to fairly fund and distribute schools. And then that gets us to where Prentice was going with saying what we need is a better, more sufficient and fair tax structure really in the long run.
Well, and Wendy, you're the expert on some of the tax stuff and how that's really this, and I think others, Daryl, you mentioned it as well, maybe Prentice, about, all the tax cuts that have, over the past 15 years and the billions of dollars that we are not seeing in revenue. And this is just, we have to really address that if we're going to continue to move. I mean, the rescue plan provides us with relief and an opportunity to start some things, but it's really about implementing better policy and raising the revenues we need to keep the movement going.
Yeah, if I might add to that, I mean, this is a good down payment. In Ohio, we have a Cradle to Career. We want to get to 65% completion of higher education in the state. If we see these American Rescue dollars as our path to that, we have already lost. Like, these dollars are meant to get us back on track, but there's so much more work to do. We know there are current federal proposals from the Biden administration around making community college tuition free for all Americans. But we need to but in order for us to actually get to 65% completion in Ohio, it doesn't only start at the college level. It starts all the way from the beginning, from early learning to college. We have to make sure that we have universal pre-K programs. You got to make sure that we have, universal child care programs that are supporting rural and urban and suburban communities to make sure that their kids are prepared and ready for kindergarten. We got to make sure that our school funding formula is fixed and that there's enough resources to pay for those new formulas so that our K through 12 experience is that everyone goes to a world-class school. And then once we get to the higher education, the cost of higher education is not just about tuition. It's housing, it's childcare, it's food. And in our state, we should not have students racking up on an average $27,000 to $30,000 in debt when we do not have a growing economy at the rate of other states. And the only way that we're going to be able to grow Ohio's economy and make sure that people, like actual people, which is Ohio's economy, get what they need to take care of their families, is making sure that on higher education that we have need-based aid so that students can go to school, not racking up debt, making sure that we are actually funding programs around childcare so that parents don't worry about how they're going to pay for school, food, and get their kids to daycare. And then we need to make sure that at minimum that we have first dollar community college programs, so that when students go to community college to start their education, that the additional money that comes through Pell Grants or through need-based aid can be used for students to live and go to school. And so that's what we need to do. And part of that will start with what Wendy's talking about, fixing our tax code, making sure that we have enough revenue, because there actually is enough for all of us. And there's certain politicians and corporate lobbyists who want us to believe that there's not enough for all of us, but there is. And if we can go out and come together and say that we can actually have an Ohio that cares for all of us and that we can all thrive, we can accomplish these things.
Yeah, thanks, Prentice. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. I feel like I was at this Senate twice this week and last week testifying, and I think there are too many people also who are in those positions who just don't understand some of the things you're talking about. What it is to go into debt just to be able to go to school at a community college, when you can barely afford the school, but you get a grant for that, but you then have all these other expenses that you really have to cover to go to school, like where you live, transportation, even childcare. And I think too many people still think that you can pay your way through school and just might take you a little bit longer. We're living in the past. And we see that a lot with the debt piece as well. Treating education debt as something really that you can profit from. We have the debt being sent to the Attorney General, and it's, often, it gets off to third-party debt collectors, and people are stuck. And there's ways. Obviously, a big portion, more than half of the rescue plan funds will go directly to students, which is really important to help them get through this. But the schools have a lot of flexibility too in how they use the money. It's for testing and safety at the schools, but they could also think about how they want to set up some programs to help get students back in and to build toward a more sustainable system, and to advocate for these kinds of issues that can bring students back and create a win for the students, and the schools will enroll more people, and then the communities will be stronger, our economy will be stronger because more people are accessing that education. So,
and we have to update the policymakers because they reflect on the days when they were going to Ohio State, and they can work all summer and pay for their full year tuition based on their summer wages. Those days are gone, and they're gone for a lot of schools. And so we have to update them about what the real world situation is for students now, and why it's important and how that impacts their beginning of a student's career. But there's one other part of student debt. It's not just the student, it's also the parent. And so we have a lot of folks who are, in their late 50s and 60s, or people on Social Security who have student debt because they tried to either go to college later or get an advanced degree later, or they paid for, assumed debt so they could reduce the debt for their children. And so now they put their own Social Security, their own retirement at risk because they're trying to help the next generation. And that's admirable. But we have to understand that debt covers not just the young, it also covers the old, and it does impact, society in different ways. And so that's one thing we also have to continue to talk about.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end, but I'd like to give everybody a chance to say something more. Wendy, what would you like to jump in on?
Thanks, Pete. I guess I'll close with saying that a lot of what we've been talking about in our last few comments highlight the fact that the private economy is not working for far too many people. In Ohio, 6 out of 10 of our largest job groups, retail, sales, fast food, etc., leave a small family eligible for and needing food assistance to put dinner on the table, let alone the cost of childcare, preschool, and then student debt, getting yourself through college. Things aren't working for working people. The American Rescue Act money gives us a chance to start a turnaround, but more is needed, and sustained effort on the part of the state lawmakers is needed. Everyone needs to pay their fair share, and we need to build a more just system.
So that's a great note to start to end on. I would just say that, we've already talked about how to get involved, and, whether it's at the local school district, your superintendent, your school board, whether it's your state legislators who need to be updated. As Daryl said, I had a conversation exactly like that where a senator the other day just thought people could pay their way through school. So the more those people who have control, whether it's local or state levels, the more they can hear from advocates, from parents, from students, the better off we'll be. So I just want to close by thanking everybody for their time today, everybody who's tuned in to listen, and Wendy, Daryl, and Prentice, thank you all for your time. And I want to invite you to please join our next installment of the American Rescue Plan and You, our series on the relief dollars coming to Ohio. We're going to discuss the rescue plan's impact on health equity in Ohio. And it's next Thursday, a week from today at 1 p.m. Aside from that, please be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to our social media accounts, and also, of course, the Ohio Federation of Teachers and Ohio Organizing Collaborative. And thank you very much. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.